with war surgery, you are seeing terrible injuries in young people because of human cruelty. It's not necessary, you know? It's not bad luck. It is evil. War is terrible, war is bad. But it is also a great engine for change. Self-help, helping each other, sort of nature of Ukrainian society, which is enormously strong family bonds, very, very strong friendship. And if the state is your enemy, or at least the state is not there to help you, everybody has to help each other. And that I've always been very impressed by.
Is there anything that maybe Ukrainians can do to stay in people's minds and hearts?
Suffer more.
That's very cynical to say. Hello, my name is Julia Tymoshenko, and you're watching Ukrainer in English, and our series of interviews Ukraine through the eyes of others, where we talk to different political experts, journalists, people who support Ukraine about their view on the Russian war against Ukraine. And today our guest is Henry Marsh, English neurosurgeon, a pioneer in neurosurgical advances, and a person who has very strong professional ties to Ukraine. Henry, welcome.
Thank you.
So you came to Ukraine for the first time in 1992.
Yes.
But if you could go back a little bit in time and remember what kind of perception you had of Ukraine before your visit.
Very little is the answer. I mean, although I had studied Soviet Eastern European politics at Oxford University before taking this rather strange career change and becoming a brain surgeon. So I knew quite a lot about the history of this area, but I must confess, you know, at that stage I saw Ukraine really as part of Russia, you know, a common mistake. But I rapidly realized this was a completely ridiculous simplification.
When you studied in Oxford, did you see if at that time Oxford Russian Studies looked at Ukraine through this like Russian imperial lens?
I think so, yes. On the whole, I think yes.
How did it manifest in your opinion?
Well, I mean, the politics I was studying was essentially the politics emanating from Moscow, and Ukraine and Ukrainians at that time were not really seen as a separate entity.
And the same about like Lithuanians, Polish, or was there?
Well, no, that they were seen more as they were seen to have separate histories, and of course, I mean the history of Ukraine is incredibly complicated, and applying a modern framework of nation states and ethnicities to the history of Ukraine is very misleading because it was very different 400 or 500 years ago. It is very complicated.
Yeah, I think you can say that about a lot of countries as well, like Poland and
yes,
Eastern Europe in general.
It's all that's why I was so interested by it. And my mother was German. She was a refugee from Nazi Germany, a political refugee. That's why I was always very interested by it, because the history is so complicated. But then if you go back to British history, you know, 1,000 years ago, that was very complicated then, with Wessex and Norway, all the different kingdoms and states, which gradually combined.
In your book, Do No Harm, you describe your visit to Ukraine. But before that, I found really interesting because you write about how you almost refused that visit because you were busy and
yes.
Somebody told you like, hey, do you want to go to Ukraine?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And they, when you said like, oh, no, I'm busy, they were like, oh, but you always said how much
that's my secretary. My secretary said, no, you're always saying you want to go to Russia, you know, and that would be my secretary who would have to cancel all the outpatient appointments and operations. I felt, well, if she was encouraging me to go, I certainly had to go. But I almost didn't go.
Yeah, but you published that book in 2014.
Yes.
And I found it interesting that you left that part when she says, do you want to go to Ukraine? But then you say no, and she's like, but you always wanted to go to Russia. Was it a deliberate choice to portray how some Brits viewed Ukraine at that time?
No, not particularly. It was more portraying how so much of life is random effects, a random chance. You know, if I had not gone to Kiev on that visit, my life would have been very, very profoundly different.
In that book, you describe that first visit in very great detail.
Yes.
For some who maybe haven't read that book, could you describe a little bit briefly how the visit went?
It was a year after independence. The economy was in a terrible state because of all the dislocation from the end of the falling apart of the Soviet Union. I knew that Soviet medicine was very behind the West, but I didn't realize just how much. It was about 50 years out of date, and the hospitals were largely empty. Nothing was happening. The factories were closed, and there was no smoke coming out of the chimneys I could see from my hotel window. So it was a very strange experience. It felt like everything had come to a stop. But at the same time, when I went to visit the very famous Neurosurgical Research Institute, which is where I was giving my lectures, there was still the old, Soviet, we are the equal of the West mentality. So I had all these old professors telling me how this is a department of this and a department of that, and this is the biggest specialist neurosurgical hospital in Europe. And yet my eyes saw a completely different, it was just empty. And I knew from my studies of the Soviet Union how disinformation or whatever, false facts, whatever Trump calls them, lying and dishonesty was part of the Soviet package. And I just find this quite funny. And then I was asked if I'd like to see anywhere else. And I said, but I'd like to see how trauma is dealt with, because there seemed to be no routine surgery going on at all. And of course, the Soviet system, and it's still the same now, you separated routine elective work, we call it, from emergency work. And in Europe, hospitals do both together. So I said, well, I'd like to see some emergency stuff. And so I was taken to the emergency hospital in Troyeshina, where the conditions were even worse than the institute. The building was only 10 years old, but already looked as though it was falling down. There were electric cables, great tangled cables hanging down from the ceilings and holes in the roof, and quite extraordinary. But there I met this very, very enthusiastic young surgeon, Kurelets, who was really the only person I met on that visit who actually said, everything is terrible here. Everybody else was saying, no, but could you bring my son to the West to study with you? And to cut a long story short, Kurelets got the permission of academician Ramadanov, who was actually a very sympathetic man. He got his permission to come to London to study with me, and he was with me for 3 months. And on the basis of that, I said, well, instead of having holidays with my family, I agree to come out to Kiev once or twice a year to help you. And I'd drive on more than one occasion. I drove from London to Kiev with second-hand operating equipment, microscopes. They had no operative microscopes here, which is, fundamental to neurosurgery. So that went on for many years. Ukraine improved, the economy got better, medicine generally improved. My colleague became very well known. But unfortunately, as he became more and more successful, he started to sort of revert back into being the rather sort of dictatorial Soviet-style professor with whom I thought I was helping him rebel against in the first place.
Why do you think that was?
I think it's because he'd grown up in the Soviet Union. He's younger than me. His strengths that made him successful in the first place, which was immense determination, hard work, and doing it himself, became a problem for him because he was unable to cooperate with other doctors, and he would only teach his son in the old Soviet nepotistic tradition. Whereas for me as a Western doctor, I see medicine very much about teamwork, about teaching as a cooperative, collaborative exercise, not as being the one big man model, which was certainly how the Soviet medical system worked, and still goes on here, too much so. So although it was very sad, I stopped working with him. And I know I had made many other medical friends, younger doctors, who had grown up after independence and had a much more open mind. So, but again, what I really wanted, my initial work was purely technical. It was bringing modern equipment, showing how to do modern surgery, which was not happening in Ukraine 30 years ago. But that changed. There are some really very, very good surgeons, neurosurgeons. I can't speak for other specialties here in Ukraine, perhaps particularly in Kiev. They have good modern equipment. You have lots of problems. There's lack of money, poor pay, corruption. You have the usual Ukrainian stuff. What I really became increasingly interested in was lecturing to medical students, to the next generation of doctors, not about anatomy and physiology and pathology and how to operate, but about really the sort of psychological and ethical aspects of being a doctor, which my books are about in many ways. And even in the West, it's very unusual for doctors to talk about their work in the way that I have done. And although I'm told by some of the medical students I've met here that they are taught now about communication, a lot of the time they say nobody really has talked to us in the way that you do. Because I talk about the problem of how to be both kind and detached at the same time. It's a problem which is very difficult as a doctor, not to become dehumanized. And obviously doctors are very variable. There are good doctors, there are bad doctors. We all have to find a balance between lots of different forces. And the funny thing is that looking back on my career, because I've stopped operating and treating patients in England, although I still teach, in retrospect, actually, the technical side is easy. And once you've learned, yes, there's a lot of work to learn it. It takes years of experience. But the problems are all about the decision-making, which is really it's not decision-making is about human values. It's not about sort of adding up technical sums. And getting on with colleagues, teamwork, terribly important, things like that. These are the really difficult things. And when I made mistakes and when patients came to harm, it wasn't because I fumbled or dropped something. Surgery's not like that. You don't need sort of steady hands. You need good decision-making, learning from mistakes, being a good colleague. And these, I think, are the really important things, which are not taught here and aren't actually taught very much in England either. So this is why I feel very privileged to be able to talk to the future doctors in Ukraine about these subjects. And they like it, because just as a doctor, you have to act and pretend to your patients to some extent. There is nothing more frightening for a patient than a frightened doctor. And we learn right from the start, as soon as we put a white coat on, we have to hide our feelings from our patients. And often we are anxious, particularly if you're becoming a surgeon. I mean, that gets less as you get older, but it never goes away. I mean, even when I was operating in the years before the end of my career, if it was a big, difficult case, I would feel anxious. But you have to hide that. And you hide it from your patients, and you hide it from your colleagues, and you hide it from all the juniors and medical students. So it's actually quite reassuring for young doctors and students to hear a very senior surgeon like me saying, I'm often anxious,
But just to go a little bit back to Soviet Union specifically,
yes.
And the Soviet system, in your book, you also dedicated some time describing the interior and exterior of the Soviet hospitals,
yes.
And you mentioned right now, why do you think the Soviets designed their healthcare system and chose such architecture and design for it? Was it a deliberate choice, in your opinion?
I think it was deliberate, yes. I mean, in the West, you had these great big block factory-like hospitals. But what made it particularly bad, I think, in the Soviet Union was the whole Potemkin village mentality of pretending things are better than they really are. So you have a big, big hospital with lots of departments. You have big, big shops. The shops are all empty, So it's part of the pretense and lie because, of course, it was dictatorship of the proletariat, the workers' paradise, and it wasn't, So it was partly making things appear more impressive than they were. And then maybe, I remember years ago, I went around the Hermitage in Petersburg with a very nice young guide who talked about Russian gigantomania. Russians like to make things really big. And this, I see partly, you might say it's partly of a whole sort of Genghis Khan Tsarist tradition. But also, this is becoming a little bit psychological, this sort of deep split in Russia, this love-hate relationship with the West. We are the equal of the West. We're up the Rome. Moscow is the third Rome. This sort of messianic view of themselves, because deep down they know they're bloody useless compared to the West. So it's a sort of an act of denial.
But what that kind of design of hospitals that are really dark, really sort of depressing, how does it influence the patients and also the staff working there?
Well, I mean, I can only be anecdotal about it. There's some research has been done. I mean, in a sense, common sense tells us that windows, the view of trees is good for us. Why do we have carpets and curtains in our homes? It's to soften the noise, to have a quiet environment. And hospitals are very bad in many countries, and many English hospitals I am very critical of. There is a saying among architects that the secret of a successful building is an informed client. In other words, the person who is instructing the architect. If the person instructing the architect understands what will make the building work well, the architect will then design a building which works well. And the problem with hospitals is, who is the client? The patients? No, the patients have no influence or say. But doctors, they have no interest in it. They're just looking at the patient's illness. The managers, absolutely no idea. So there's a great big gap. And then the architects just end up building sort of hospitals as machines. They're just like big operating theatres with long corridors, with very little thought about making it a more humane environment. But there are many reasons. Another reason is lack of money, and another reason is often hospitals are built in cities where there's a lack of space. But there is nothing inevitable about bad design. There are some very beautiful hospitals in Scandinavia, in Denmark, and there's a very famous firm of architects in Switzerland called Herzog and de Meuron, who did, if you know Tate Modern in London, they did that. And they're building two hospitals, one a children's hospital in Salzburg, the other one, can't remember, but I've seen the plans. I was shown an exhibition. Wonderful hospitals.
What makes them wonderful?
Because they're designed with the idea, is this a building which will make me feel better? And we feel better if we have light, if we can see green growing things like that. And one of my proudest achievements in my hospital in London is there was a balcony, a big empty balcony, which was there by mistake, immediately outside my two neurosurgical wards. And I got my charitable money and made these into a garden, a roof garden. And the patients can get straight out of their bed into a very nice garden, which is very unusual. I cannot measure scientifically that this makes a big difference, but it is very, very popular with both patients and staff. But it was any good luck that there was this balcony. If you want to have environmental enhancements, as the architects call it, you really need to plan it from the start. You can't. It's very difficult to add it on when the building has already been made. And also, the third reason is patients are underdogs. Nobody cares that much about patients, and medicine is seen just as a technical exercise. And again, mind and matter are separate things. So how the patients feel doesn't really matter. Their feelings aren't important. This is the old-fashioned way of looking at medicine.
You mentioned Russian obsession with gigantic buildings and gigantic architecture, and a lot of historians and researchers of that totalitarian architecture era say that it was done deliberately to make the human feel small.
Yes.
And as a part of just gigantic system where you don't decide anything and you're not a part of anything.
The state is this huge monolithic structure. But of course the state is a nomenclatura, and all these human beings who are busy grabbing everything and suppressing everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like the hospitals also almost are like a part of that oppressive
Yes, I think
system.
in many ways they were. And again, in the Soviet Union, they made very good rockets, very good guns, but healthcare was a low priority, except for the people at the top of the system who had better hospitals.
And since you have this story of almost, like starting the exchange of doctors in neurosurgery by bringing your colleague from here to...
And I brought many Ukrainian doctors came to work with me in London.
And in the Soviet Union, as we know, there was almost Iron Curtain, no possibility of traveling, no possibility of exchange of these ideas or experiences. How do you think that impacted the knowledge, especially in medical system here?
Well, in the early years, I knew many cases where I can only speak for neurosurgery, young Ukrainian neurosurgeons came to England, many to work with me. And when they came back to Ukraine, they were fired, they were sacked. Because, of course, they now knew more modern neurosurgery than the professor, and that was a threat to the boss. And I know of several cases where that happened. And that reflects, all medical systems reflect the society in which they function. And the Soviet Union was very hierarchical, and the medical system was very hierarchical as well.
I think...
It's changing, but I think without wanting to sound very rude, I think a whole generation of old professors needs to move on before necessary reforms need to be made. And I can only speak for neurosurgery. I've only seen a small part of it. I depend a lot on what I'm told by my colleagues, so my view is very one-sided. But to me, at the moment, the biggest difference now between Ukrainian neurosurgery and in the West, and I've worked in America, I've worked in many countries, is that there's no proper postgraduate training. It's chaos, and it's still very much just dependent upon the professor. So there's no organized training, and that's a huge problem, because it means people can sort of claim to be neurosurgeons when they haven't really had a proper training in the way they get in America and Europe.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge issue, and I think it's very powerful what you said about that the medical system is sort of a reflection of the society
very much so.
In which it operates, and obviously Ukrainian society in Ukraine has been changing in the last 3 years even more rapidly.
Yes.
So
war is a great engine for change. I was in Lviv 3 days ago. The very really famous Canadian historian Margaret Macmillan, who wrote one of the best books about the First World War. She was giving a lecture at UKU. But she has also written a book called War, which is really a series of stories. I mean, yes, war is terrible, war is bad, but it is also a great engine for change as well. And some of the change, yes, more weapons are invented, but there are some good changes as well. It changes society. Women got the vote in England because of the First World War, for instance. So it's very complex. So although the war at the moment is a nightmare, is not all bad. It is forcing, and I'm sure, there has been less corruption now in Ukraine, partly because of the war.
Yeah, that my question was, what are some positive changes that you're seeing in Ukrainian medical system and society as well?
I said my view is very limited, so it's hard. I mean, I've always been very impressed when I've come to Ukraine right from the start, what the sort of stubborn self-help helping each other sort of nature of Ukrainian society, which is enormously strong family bonds, very, very strong friendship. And if the state is your enemy, or at least the state is not there to help you, everybody has to help each other. And that I've always been very impressed by. And obviously the biggest obvious change from the war is Putin has made Ukraine a much more united nation. I mean, he's achieved the absolute opposite of what he thought. And I don't know, but I believe that there is less corruption now. There is still too much corruption, but there is less than there was. The economic situation before the war, well, I don't know, about, was it 12 oligarchs owned about 50% of the economy? It was even worse than Russia. I mean, that needs to change. Whether it's changing yet or not, I do not know. But we all know that inequality is bad for everybody. Inequality is bad for the people at the top of the ladder and bad for people at the bottom of the ladder. And it's a big problem in America, and actually it's a big problem in England as well. The Anglo-Saxon model of neoliberal capitalism is why we have Trump, you know.
Some might ask, how is it bad for people at the top?
Well, there's evidence. The research suggests they're unhappy, you know. Money doesn't actually buy you love, you know.
Yeah, we can see it with people like Trump, I guess, and Elon Musk as well. When you were talking about the buildings of hospitals, you said that it's sometimes easier to build a new thing rather than, remodeling whatever we have from the inside or outside. When you look at the Soviet medical system and how still maybe it's engraved in the Ukrainian system currently, and the same with like educational system, and you mentioned something about the specifically medical education. Why do you think it's so difficult to get rid of that past?
Well, partly, if you have old people in charge, they stick to the past. Secondly, change is difficult, and radical change often produces the opposite of what you want. Sometimes slow changes bit by bit are perhaps better than trying to turn everything upside down and start anew. The answer is it is difficult, but it's certainly almost impossible, say with the medical system, if the medical system is still run by the old people who ran it in the past. I don't know the average age of medical professors in Ukraine, but I mean in most European and American countries, people retire between the ages of sort of 65 and 70. And then hand over to. And one reason I retired from medicine in London when I was 65 was to make way for one of my trainees who was very good and, needs to start as a senior doctor. You need to make room for the next generation, not cling to power.
Do you think it's also about some values and just mindset that is maybe even passed on to younger doctors as well? Because
I hope it isn't, but yes. I mean, it is. And again, old people tend to be conservative. They like to stick with what they are familiar with.
Yeah, but I feel like, unfortunately, even in my generation or generation of my parents, there's still who spent most of their time, obviously, in free Ukraine. There's still those, leftover parts of Soviet Union that persist sometimes.
I know. Well, it's sad, but it happens.
Yeah, it's truly sad. In one of your interviews, you said that you were a big fan of Ulana Suprun, Ukrainian Minister of Health.
Yes, I've met her many times. Yes,
and the reforms that she was trying to achieve. Why do you think her reforms were a great fit for Ukraine, and what are some obstacles you think she faced?
I'm not an expert on this field, but in my opinion, the basis of any good, effective healthcare system is primary care and the family practitioner system. Now, if you look at countries like Scandinavia again, or like Norway, where they have a very strong family practitioner system, it used to be very strong in England, but there have been many, many problems with the National Health Service, as the English government medical system is called. And they're called general practitioners. They were the fundamental building block of the system. If you had an illness, you saw the family doctor first. The family doctor was the gatekeeper as to whether you then were sent to see a specialist or not. If you have a system where anybody can go and see a specialist without this kind of gatekeeping filter first. It's actually very inefficient, although it is good for specialists if they make money from seeing patients. But there was a fantastic piece of research published from Norway 2 years ago. Norway is only 4.5 million population, and it has very complete data sets. And they looked at 4.5 million Norwegians, comparing people who had had the same family doctor for more than 1 year with people who'd had a family doctor for less than 1 year. And the outcome was, and certainly the longer you'd had the same doctor, was that you were 25% less likely to die. People who'd only had a family doctor for 1 year had a much higher risk of death. They had a much higher rate of being sent to hospital, and they had a much higher rate of calling out on emergencies. It's called continuity of care. The model, a good doctor knows his patients, has lived with them, like the traditional model, the traditional story of the family doctor who delivers a baby and then delivers that baby's baby in the next generation. So good primary care is by far the most equitable and efficient way of basing your healthcare system. And it's a common criticism of America and Great Britain, but there is an overemphasis on hospitals. Hospitals are very expensive. Over-treatment is a big problem in modern medicine, where you do too many scans, too many operations, things like that. So that is why I think Ulana's attempt to set primary care on a good footing in Ukraine was absolutely the right thing to do.
And what kind of obstacle do you think she faced?
Well, I mean, so I don't know, because I haven't spoken. I haven't spoken to her or other people in detail about it. But it would be a threat to specialists who want to see lots and lots of patients because they make money from it, and maybe patients don't like it. They want to go straight to see a specialist. I mean, there are many Ukrainians in England now, of course, and I meet many of them. And they complain bitterly about how difficult it is to see any sort of doctor in England. Whereas in Ukraine, you can pick up the phone and you can get 4 different opinions in 24 hours. But the slight difference is when you do finally see a doctor in England, you probably will get a more reliable opinion than you do here. But having said that, there are problems in England at the moment with the healthcare system. But again, there are problems in every country in the world because there are more and more old people and more expensive medical technology. So it is a problem.
Yeah, and obviously here, a war creates a new set of
and then, of course, there's the war.
Issues.
Yes.
Yeah. You've been in Ukraine a lot throughout these last 10 years of the Russian war against our country. What are some new challenges that you've noticed that came with the war?
Well, I'm not a trauma surgeon. My specialty is peacetime brain surgery. Brain surgery actually has very little role to play in war surgery. I think about 75% of fatalities, battlefield fatalities, are from head injuries, is usually lethal, and you cannot and do not carry out complex major brain surgery for battlefield head injuries. It's very simple, basic surgery, stitching up the skin, fixing a broken skull, things like that. You can't fix a broken vein. So I'm not really in a very good position to answer that question. So I don't know.
And about, I guess, the role of doctors. How do you think the role of doctors in wars changed, if you thought about it, maybe?
Well, it's going to be speculative on my part, because I have not been to the front and I don't intend to go to the front. There is no need for me to go. I can only say that obviously psychologically, as doctors, as I was saying earlier, when I lecture medical students, all doctors have to find a balance between compassion, kindness, and detachment. And when we see patients with illness, it's bad luck. Although, yes, if they're very fat and smoke and diabetic, some of it is their lifestyle, but even then I wouldn't blame them. I would say that's a reflection on society and on the way they've been brought up as children, etc., etc. But with war surgery, you are seeing terrible injuries in young people because of human cruelty. It's not necessary, It's not bad luck. It is evil. And that, I don't know how my medical colleagues, whether that changes things for them. But it must be. Obviously, when we see young people with terrible injuries, it is more distressing. So to keep the balance between sympathy and detachment is going to be more difficult. So you're more likely, I would imagine, to burn out and suffer compassion fatigue, because it's going to be that much more stressful, as well as which, if you're at the front, your own life is at risk as well. I mean, and was it in Suma a couple of weeks ago, several doctors are killed in a missile attack on a hospital.
Yeah, and I think when it's sort of, I want to say natural, I don't know if it's a correct term, if it's a disease that strikes a person, it's like sort of like one thing, and then
yes, exactly, it's bad luck. It's not the deliberate act by other human beings, and in particular that wretched man in the Kremlin.
Yeah, and I think in your book you talk a lot about dealing sort of with the consequences of not being able to save someone.
Yes, yeah.
Or, asking yourself whether you made a mistake or whether that was, whether you could have done something.
Yes.
Obviously, as you said, doctors who deal with war trauma and soldiers who have been hurt on the front lines and who are very often unable to save them from injuries that are not
it'd be even more traumatic.
With life.
Yes.
As somebody who thought about that, dealing with that concept of, I guess, death and not being able to save people, what kind of, knowledge, wisdom you would share with doctors dealing with something like this today here?
Well, it partly depends on your own personality, your own experience, and we all have a limit. But we all will break beyond a certain point. But the greatest strength, the main resilience we have as doctors, is having good colleagues, being part of a team who all like and love and trust each other. That is your main defense against the stress of the work.
In your book, you also have a lot of parallels between neurosurgery and war. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you say that aneurysm is like a bomb explosive
for cowards.
Work, or that sort of like after a successful surgery, you feel like a
conquering hero.
Hero after
I used
battle.
to, not as I got older.
Why do you think those are similar in a way?
Because you're dealing with life and death. So much medicine now in the West is being run more and more like a sort of management business. And medicine's not. There you have doctors have this enormous responsibility, and with that comes great rewards, but also tremendous stress. And seeing what goes on in medicine is just being like, going to buy a car or going to a supermarket. Or a business or a bank. It's not like that at all. And I think a lot of politicians and managers in the West don't understand that, and they feel threatened by doctors because they sort of say, but the doctor-patient relationship is really unlike any other relationship, other than perhaps men and women in war. It's very intense.
Do you think the concept of responsibility changes a little bit during a war, even if it's not for doctors who are working on the front lines, but doctors even working in more civilian conditions?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, war brings many people together, but not everybody. One of the terrible tragedies of the war here is all the best people volunteered, and so many of them now have been killed. Men like Ratushin. I mean, it's awful.
Yeah.
And of course, many people fled to the West. And a question that interests me is, what will happen to? Because the people have stayed. It will look slightly, the English word is askance, at the ones who ran away. My friends in Lviv have all stayed. They've stayed with their children and families. It's very difficult. They could have left, but they didn't. And Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether in fact the Ukrainian diaspora will become a sort of separate group.
Yeah, obviously people who are staying here are dealing with a different level of trauma that is being resurfacing all the time, even in generally considered safe areas like we're here right now. A lot of doctors as well, I think, joined the armed forces and front lines. So
well, as doctors, most of us become doctors because we want to save lives. We want to help people, believe it or not.
You've talked a little bit about how when you lecture medical students, you talk mostly about ethical issues.
Yes, sort of psychological and ethical issues, yes.
Could you maybe give some examples of...
Well, I was talking yesterday about several things, but I mean, a lot of what I try to talk about is communication, about the doctor-patient relationship. I think I didn't really understand it when I was young. And I think many young doctors and students don't understand it now. And I speak as a patient with cancer. Being a patient is a very frightening, degrading, humiliating, demeaning experience. Always, it varies to some extent. But doctors have a tremendous power over patients. And it's a particularly bad problem here in Ukraine, where patients really have very, very little redress against doctors if things go badly. In the Soviet time, they had no redress at all. You couldn't sue the state. And although doctors in America and Europe do not like lawyers and do not like being sued, it is a necessary evil. Or there are different ways of doing it. In countries like New Zealand and Sweden, there is automatic compensation for medical mistakes. You don't have to go to court over it, which I think is a good system, but it costs money. So I try to explain to medical students to get them to try to understand what it's like to be a patient, because when you're young and healthy, you don't really know what it's like to be old, to be frightened of dying, to be in pain, to be sort of pushed along hospital corridors on a trolley. And again, I try to explain, if you treat patients well, if you're with good manners, the work is much more rewarding. I was quoting a famous American family doctor called Rita Charon, who has created something called narrative medicine, where you teach medical students mainly to see their patients as all having a story rather than just an illness. It's another way of this holistic medicine business. And she says in an interview I read that, small acts of kindness from a doctor to a patient, things which in everyday life are nothing very special, helping somebody to put their coat on, opening the door for them, holding their hand for a moment. I often give the example of sitting on the patient's bed, things that are not a big deal in normal life. In the medical relationship, it's hugely impactful. For a patient, patients do not expect doctors to be very kind or polite on the whole. And yet if you are, the patients love you, like you, you'll have a much better relationship with them. And, God forbid, if things go badly, they're much more likely to forgive you and go on trusting you. And it makes the work much more rewarding and interesting than if you just see patients as bodies with an illness. But of course, the trouble is, the more you care for your patients, the more it hurts when you can't help them, or if you do things badly and you blame yourself for it. So it's a difficult balance.
How do you navigate that balance of not attaching yourself to
it's like being on a tightrope. You sort of wobble, sometimes you get it too much one side, too much the other side. And it's difficult. And with some patients, you will feel more at ease with them than with others. It varies. And yet we all hate, as doctors, we all dislike treating other doctors because we know they don't have this blind automatic belief in us. So it's quite complicated.
When we look at specifically Ukrainian educational system and again, the impact of our favorite part of history, Soviet Union, I think the concept of making mistakes is a very almost like taboo. It's something that was never...
Well, one reason why my first book has been a sort of worldwide bestseller is actually it's very unusual. Medical memoirs traditionally fall into two main categories. There's slightly satirical sort of kiss and tell type books by young doctors who don't ultimately carry responsibility for what happens to patients. And there are many, many examples in England. There was a very successful book, which I did not like, called This Is Going to Hurt, by an English doctor called...
I've heard about it.
Yeah, it's a huge bestseller, which really just tells lots of sort of dirty stories about patients. I didn't like it. It was very, very popular, quite funny, written as a comedy. And then at the other extreme, there are medical memoirs by senior professors, usually after retirement, which basically are like political memoirs, which are about how great I was, you know. And then Marsh writes this rather unusual book, where he says, you know, I was a very senior doctor and I kept on making mistakes and had to learn from them. So it is a bit of a taboo subject, even more here. I mean, it's years ago, but there was Solzhenitsyn wrote one of his collection of short stories as "We never make mistakes." You know, when the NKVD arrested somebody, complete nonsense arrest. We never make mistakes. You know, as by definition, the state is right. And of course, having that attitude for doctors makes your life as a doctor much easier. You know, you don't have to blame yourself or beat yourself up. But the problem with that is, of course, we learn most from failure. We learn most by making mistakes. And if we deny mistakes, particularly if we deny them to ourselves, we will not learn. And again, if you do not discuss your mistakes with your colleagues, they will not learn, you know. And I regard one purpose of my lectures, when I lecture to medical colleagues. I was in Mexico a few weeks lecturing at a big neurosurgical conference. I was saying that we have a duty as senior doctors to stop our colleagues and our trainees from making the mistakes we made. So one should discuss them. But that's not easy. No, we don't like being self-critical. All doctors, particularly surgeons, need self-confidence, high self-esteem. And of course, there's a paradox that somebody like me, who is very open, and I show slides in my professional neurosurgical lectures of terrible complications, which are my fault, patients who died or left with terrible brain damage. Paradoxically, you have to be very self-confident to stand up in public and say, you know, I fuck up. So where I get that self-confidence from, I'm not quite sure, but it's certainly partly related to the fact I went late into medicine. I wasn't a doctor until I was almost 30 years old. I'd had a separate career almost. I was going to become a criminologist. I got a very, very good top degree at Oxford University, and I had very loving parents, had fantastic education. All that sort of made me feel a bit separate from the medical profession. So some people say Marsh is arrogant and pleased with himself. Many people call me a maverick, you know. But it's outsiders or semi-outsiders who can sometimes show things to people that have been in front of them, but they hadn't quite seen.
Have you ever thought of what your life would be like if you had become a criminologist?
God knows. I don't know. I mean, but the thing is that although my academic record is good, I like making things. I like using my hands. You know, my mother she was no Marxist, but who was a German refugee, but I remember when I was very young, she quoted Marx to me saying, no, the ancient philosophers interpreted the world, but the point is to change it, you know, and that was the sort of philosophy I was brought up in by my parents. And my parents are among the group of people who founded Amnesty International, which is a fantastic organization.
Going back to making mistakes, it got me thinking a little bit about how a lot of people abroad who are fond of Ukraine now, who have been following Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion and sort of like admire now Ukrainian people, inevitably in the war, you're also going to make mistakes.
Yes.
And as leaders of our country, we obviously hold them to very high standard, but we also know that they're going to make mistakes. How do you then maybe grapple with the sense of Ukraine not being such a perfect country that a lot of foreigners who maybe have never visited Ukraine imagine? And what would you say to them about, the war is still going on, Ukraine is inevitably going to make mistakes?
In England, actually, in Britain, there are very few voices against Ukraine. It is not a political issue, unlike in Hungary and AfD in Germany, or Vance and Trump in America. Nobody disputes the strength and truth of the Ukrainian cause. But there are some people who do. Firstly, it's the old nonsense about NATO provoked Putin, as though the Baltic republics wanted to invade Russia. I mean, it's rubbish. It's totally buying the lies from the Kremlin. Although, having said that, historically, the Kremlin was often very paranoid about the West. And then it's a very corrupt country, to which my answer is yes. But that's exactly what the war is about. The war is about escaping the corrupt dictatorship of the Soviet past. And yes, there is still corrupt Soviet-style corruption and autocracy in Ukraine, but the war is about getting rid of it. That is my answer to them.
Yeah, exactly, because I think a lot of people point it out as a argument to not support Ukraine.
When the opposite is the case. But that's because they don't know Ukraine, they don't know about Maidan, well, we know a little bit about Maidan, but, the attempt to create a civil society of a new generation of people like yourself.
This is a little bit more maybe a philosophical question, not practical, because I know that you don't go to front lines and you obviously don't participate in that.
Firstly, my wife would go mad of anxiety. She hates it. She's convinced every Shahed and every missile has my name written on it. But there's no need for me to go to the front because I'm not a trauma surgeon. I'm sure my medical colleagues there would be delighted to see me. But I have to balance the risk, not to myself, but the risk to my wife's nervous state. And would it really make a big difference? No, is the answer.
I think that's very fair. You feel that responsibility.
Other people would say I'm a coward, and I'm not using my wife's anxiety as an excuse. But
well, a lot of people also go to front lines where there shouldn't be there.
Well, it's war tourism, and I'm not a war tourist.
Exactly. Yeah. The question that I wanted to ask is the concept of do no harm that is obviously so widely known in medicine and research. How do you think it applies in wars? Again, not on practical, but maybe in more philosophical level.
As dear Trotsky said, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. I'm not a soldier. It must be very terrible being a commanding officer, knowing that you will make decisions. Inevitably, many of your men will be killed. I would not wish to be in that situation. But that's what war is about. It's about men killing other men. And now you're going to be busy killing North Koreans, by all accounts.
So I can't believe still myself that is true, and this is the news that we're at in the third year of this war. But that's a part of as well, that de-escalation tactic that a lot of U.S. politicians and some Western politicians have been using.
And this is a big problem, isn't it? But we mustn't provoke Putin. I've rather taken the view Putin is a rational actor. He's never going to use nuclear weapons. And obviously the people on Russian TV saying, oh, yes, a nuclear bomb will destroy all of London.
Yeah.
Oh, nonsense. Yeah, a nuclear bomb will destroy all of Moscow. That's stupid. But it's part of the hosepipe propaganda technique. You just scare people, and it works to some extent. But I was slightly concerned and distressed, really, when listening to Professor Macmillan 2 days ago in Lviv, who said she'd just been in Washington, D.C. at a meeting with various American generals. And she was saying, well, we don't really know what Putin's mental state is like. He was totally isolated during COVID. We just don't know what he would do. All we do know is he wants to hang on to power, and he feels he can't afford to lose. So she seemed to be rather implying that American hesitancy over allowing Ukraine to strike deep in the Russian territory, maybe there's some justification for it. But of course, if you can't do that, you're tying Ukrainian army's hands behind its back. And you could almost say you shouldn't have helped them in the first place. And anyway, then, of course, you face the problem of Trump and J.D. Vance and the second coming. Really, the future is just madly uncertain at the moment.
Specifically with, I guess, J.D. Vance and Trump and their stance of just allowing Russia to swallow territory.
Yes, exactly,
and pretend as if that solves the problem.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate that a lot of people in
well, and the fact that so many Americans are going to vote for two people who are so obviously unsuited to running anything, let alone the world political order, is horrifying. But that comes back to what I was saying earlier about neoliberal economics and huge inequality, which is part of the problem.
And then I think Russian disinformation also plays
of course, yes,
a huge role.
No, very much. The Russians have been very, very good at disinformation and Maskarovka and everything else.
Exactly. How do you assess the international medical community's response to the full-scale invasion in Ukraine?
I don't know. I hear anecdotal stories about many wounded Ukrainian soldiers being treated in Western hospitals. But whether there's any coordination, I don't know. I suspect it's all just individual initiatives by individual hospitals and doctors, but I don't know the answer to that.
Do you think there should be?
Of course there should be, yes. We should help Ukraine as much as possible. I've just bought a four-wheel drive Jeep for some military friends. So having been working in Ukraine to save lives, I'm now providing kit for the army.
That's amazing. We're obviously very grateful for that.
It's nothing, yeah.
Yeah, specifically, I think, because there's a lot of talks about organizations such as International Red Cross that have been trying to play this game of neutrality while we feel like failing actually addressing the real issues in Ukraine, and maybe sometimes even helping the perpetrators, because there is information about International Red Cross in Belarus, I think, and Russia helping to kidnap Ukrainian people, Ukrainian children, and also sometimes, providing aid to the Russians.
It's very difficult, isn't it? I don't know what's going on at the moment, but thinking of the Second World War, the International Red Cross had to cooperate with the Nazis in order to look after at least the Allied prisoners of war, although of course the Russian and Ukrainian prisoners of war all starved to death.
Exactly.
So it's a difficult balancing act, and I don't know what should be done there.
Yeah, and that concept, what do you think about the concept of neutrality in doctors, and specifically maybe this war?
I think as a doctor you should treat everybody. So if you had a wounded Russian soldier or even a wounded North Korean soldier, you should treat them anyway. It's terribly important to treat prisoners well. Because, I'm told a lot of the Russian soldiers are told, if you are captured by the Ukrainians, you'll be tortured and crucified and burnt alive, etc., etc. And it's really important for the Ukrainian army to stick to the Geneva Convention and treat Russian prisoners well. Very important.
Yeah, I think it's a difference, obviously, when torture becomes a systemic use of control and force, whether obviously there are cases that happens on the side of Ukraine as well. But as we know, those are rather isolated, and our authorities would speak up about them as well.
No, it really must be kept to a minimum. Otherwise you end up... it's complicated. Germany started bombing Rotterdam and Guernica, and then the Americans and the British killed hundreds of thousands of German women and children, flattening all the German cities. War brings out the worst in people. But I do think it's really important that Russian prisoners are treated well.
I mean, we see that as an evidence when Ukrainians POWs come back, and we see
the contrast.
Yeah.
But again, you're fighting for civilized values, and if you wander away from civilized values, it greatly weakens your strength.
Exactly. The concept of death overall has been so omnipresent and has been sort of a common denominator in Ukraine, especially the last 3 years. In one of your interviews, you said that you still think that Ukrainians sort of have not accepted death fully, have not maybe reconciliated with it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if I said that what I meant. I mean, I do understand. I mean, all Westerners who come to Ukraine at the moment, almost all of them report back on the word is resilience. And of course, it's a resilience partly based on the fact the war is an existential battle. You know, Ukraine under Russia is worse than being dead in many ways. And not everybody in the West understands that. But of course, because the history of Ukraine is one of war, famine, bloodshed, murder, you know, Professor Yaroslav Hrysak, who was talking, had breakfast with him 3 days ago in Lviv, wonderful man. But he was saying that probably a third of the population of Ukraine died violently in the 20th century. It's terrible, but it does give Ukrainians a toughness, a resilience, which we just don't have in Western Europe, based on terrible suffering.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of misconceptions about the subject that you're a very big proponent of, assisted dying.
Yes, yeah.
What do you think assisted dying means actually in for countries that are in such conditions as Ukraine is right now?
Well, it's difficult because assisted dying, if you legalize assisted dying, the strength of the safeguards are no stronger than your legal. You need a robust legal system if you're going to have assisted dying. In war, if you're talking about battlefield injuries, things like that, well, it doesn't really apply. I mean, you will have soldiers. The principle of trauma surgery is triage. You divide the injured into 3 groups. Those who are going to die anyway, those whose life you might be able to save if you intervene very quickly, and those who can wait for delayed treatment. In fact, most neurosurgical injuries fall into the third category. So, you know, it's part of battlefield, of war medicine, but you have to make these ruthless decisions. You can't treat everybody, and you have to consign quite a significant number of people to leave them to die. And if you're humane and you have morphine, you'll give them morphine to help them. So that is sort of assisted dying, but I think it doesn't really. The assisted dying arguments I deploy in England about in times of peace is totally different from the situation here. So we needn't talk too much about it because assisted dying doesn't really apply very much at the moment in Ukraine, partly because the legal system is not very robust and partly because of the war. But in countries, there are many, many countries which now permit assisted dying. There are different ways of doing it. All of them depend upon safeguards, so that you say the patient asking for an assisted death must have a clear mind, and it must be clear they're not being bullied or forced into it by somebody else. And this is a considered rational decision. And in the many countries where this is permitted, there's a long list of countries, there really is no evidence that this is leading to abuse, which is the argument raised against it mainly by some older palliative care doctors in England. All good medicine is about evidence, not about opinion, and there is evidence now because many countries have permitted it. I think we will have it soon in England, but it will take a little time yet. Having said that, I'd like to talk a little bit about my latest project in Ukraine, which is in palliative care. I'm not a palliative care doctor, but one of my closest friends in England is a very, very famous writer and palliative care doctor called Rachel Clark, who, like me, went into medicine late. Like me, she went to Oxford University, studied politics, philosophy, and economics, and then decided to become a doctor. So although she's 20 years younger than I am, there's sort of funny parallels. And we only met when she wrote to me after my first book was published, and we became very, very good friends. So long before the war, I'd wanted to bring her to Ukraine. I love bringing other English colleagues here to see what might result. But then because of the pandemic and then the war, she wasn't able to come here until it was October 2022. Unfortunately, we arrived in Kiev at exactly the same time as the first cruise missiles of the opening of the Russian bombing campaign. Not that that put either of us off, but and with the help of colleagues, particularly my close friend, Dr. Andriy Mizak, who, like me, is a neurosurgeon and you could call him one of my protégés, I suppose, we have made a good contact with a palliative care doctor here in Kiev, who runs a charity called Svoye, I think, and with a wonderful little hospice in Sambia near Lviv, which is a beautiful building and beautifully run. Palliative care in Ukraine is not the same as palliative care in the West. Palliative care in the West is only for people who are dying and are probably going to die quite soon. So it's trying to give them as good a death as possible. Here it is really looking after people with sometimes with long-term problems, as well as people who are dying from cancer. And we had a big charity event in London last year, raised so far about, I think, almost $100,000, which we're channeling to our colleagues here. But what we really want to do is teaching. It's not me, it's Rachel and her colleagues in England, is teaching and education. Palliative care is a real specialty in its own right. It's not widely practiced or taught in Ukraine.
Why do you think that the case? That it's not?
Well, it's often the case when people are dying, the medical profession loses interest in them, you know. And that historically was the same in England. England, in fact, the hospice movement started in Britain. It's one thing I'm quite proud about.
Why do you think it started in England? What prompted it?
Probably one or two dynamic people, and then it was a bit of a snowball effect. And it's mainly run on a charitable basis. The government doesn't help very much financially. Doctors traditionally see death as a failure and rather avoid it, you know. So, in fact, being a palliative care doctor is very rewarding in many ways. We all have to die, and if we can make people's death as good is not quite the word, but as easy and meaningful as possible. Rachel says it's wonderfully rewarding. But she's very, very keen to set up online training with our colleagues here. And the hospice in Sambia has all sorts of very impressive plans. They want to start build an extra building for wounded soldiers with incurable cancer. Apparently there are a lot of them, and at the moment the Ukrainian medical system doesn't know what to do with them. And our colleagues in Sambia have plans there, but of course it needs funding, it needs money, etc., etc. But I mean, I'm very impressed by how determined our colleagues are there. And Rachel and I have great plans, and I hope we can carry on doing them.
I hope so too. When it comes to technology, you mentioned a little bit about your book as well, how it's changing a lot of neurosurgery. How do you see the future?
Well, paradoxically, with neurosurgery, technological progress has meant less neurosurgery. There are better ways of treating things than open surgery. It's always difficult to predict the future. One of the biggest problems in brain surgery is cancer of the brain, called a glioblastoma. This is not a secondary cancer from lung or breast, but actually a tumor that grows in the brain itself, and almost everybody dies from it despite treatment. It's not a surgical illness, but if some new form of immunotherapy or something like that, that would be wonderful. There's lots of research, but at the moment, not much progress. Functional work, and in particular using brain implants, Elon Musk and Neuralink, things like that.
You rolled your eyes there.
Well, yeah.
Do you feel skeptical about that?
I'm skeptical about Musk. I mean, yes, he's obviously very brilliant in his own way, but he's got some terrible opinions. He's not...
He's fully campaigning for Trump right now.
I know, exactly. And the idea that just because somebody is a billionaire, they should have this huge influence, even though Starlink has been very helpful, thank you. I mean, it's all wrong that people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk have so much influence. They become dictators, in effect, just because of wealth, which is not good. But thinking of all the amputees and spinal injuries from the war, I hope there'll be further progress where you can connect electrical wires to the brain and bypass injuries in the spinal cord, or connect prosthetic arms to the muscles electrically. And there's lots of work doing that, and there's remarkable progress. But as of all these things, of course, it's very expensive. But I did visit Superhumans, a rehab place in Vynnyky outside Lviv, and that was fantastic. That's all been financed by the Pinchuk Foundation. But real state-of-the-art stuff and very good prostheses, I think all from Germany, bought commercially, not charitably donated. But there'll be, and of course there's going to be a whole generation of injured men and women in Ukraine who will be here for years to come, who need help. And then, of course, all the post-traumatic stress disorder and all the terrible problems veterans have, as we know from America's very successful campaigns in Vietnam and Iran and Afghanistan.
Yeah, truly. When it comes to technologies, Ukrainians right now on the battlefield are trying to replace as many sort of like risky soldier operations with drones.
Yes.
And they're using a lot of those remote sort of technologies. And obviously that is very rapidly advancing, especially in the last year and a half. There have also been, now, I guess, trials of remote surgery performed where the doctor was being elsewhere
with a robot.
With a robot. How do you feel about that?
I have no idea. I'd have to see. It's a question of evidence. I'd have to see what the results are like. I think I don't know. I'm a bit skeptical about it.
Why are you skeptical?
Because if it's a robot without a surgeon actually there, it's. If things go wrong, it might be wrong. I mean, the role of robots at the moment, which is mainly on prostate and kidney surgery, is it's a robot. It's a human. It's a surgeon, but using a robot. It's not a robot being controlled by somebody millions of miles away. So, I'm not quite sure what's being done.
On one hand, I mean, for Ukraine, it could be great if, some of the best surgeons could perform surgeries remotely here, but obviously we don't have enough evidence to see how that plays out in the future. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the UK. You've mentioned it many times about, the healthcare system, about your background there, and if we go back to pre-2022 and sort of UK's view on Russia, do you think there was enough understanding of the actual threat that Russia poses before 2022 in the UK?
No, there wasn't, because the Russian oligarchs had moved into London big time.
Chelsea?
Chelsea, all over the place. And there were money launderers. There was City of London with lots of horrible British lawyers were laundering huge sums of money. And it was very cynical. But, Britain has been very cynical historically in many ways. So I think people just preferred not to look clearly at what was going on. And that was partly because there was a Conservative government, and Russia was putting a lot of money, giving money to the Conservative government. It was quite a corrupt relationship. That, of course, has changed now with the change of government. But overall, of an official level, I think I was told that, even now, despite the catastrophe of Brexit, Britain has always been very strong in the EU for pushing against Russia.
Since the full-scale invasion, a lot of the Brits became incredibly supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah. Mm.
And it's almost remarkable for us.
Well, it's part of the British tradition of supporting underdogs. It goes back as deep roots historically. We feel sorry for underdogs. We don't like bullies, basically.
Do you think these events also enriched sort of like historical and cultural understanding of Ukraine in UK?
There's a good organisation in London called the Ukraine Institute London, which I support, which certainly is trying very hard to keep Ukraine in the public eye, but Israel is not helping. And Ukraine fatigue, and you have to kill an awful lot of Ukrainians now to get back in the headlines. Israelis are out doing that.
Yeah.
It sounds horribly cynical, but it's grotesque and horrible and very sad. But I see no signs of sort of lack of any weakening of support for Ukraine in England. I see no signs of that at all.
You mentioned Ukraine fatigue. Obviously, it sounds more like a rhetorical question,
yes.
But why do you think people got tired when it's not even, when we say we got tired as Ukrainians, we're like directly impacted? And then,
of course. Novelty wears off, outrage wears off, compassion wears out. We adapt, it's human nature.
Just, I guess it's very sad that the novelty of headlines of large casualties here, that's only the thing that breaks the news.
Exactly.
And even North Korea sending the troops is not on the front pages.
Well, it hasn't happened yet. This is now the South Korean intelligence agencies saying it, isn't it? I think, but having said that, the BBC News website, there is a separate section on the war in Ukraine, and they do continue to report regularly, in depth. So it hasn't disappeared from view, not yet.
And definitely Telegraph's podcast and the late David Knowles and his legacy is really big, and they've done great work covering Ukraine for sure. When it comes to political support, you obviously said that it's not such a partisan issue.
It's not at all.
As in the US.
No, it's not a partisan issue.
Why do you think is that the case? Because obviously there's a lot of still divide between the parties in the UK on a lot of issues.
Good question. I think it comes back to this business of we don't like bullies. It's just, again, but I can't understand why so many Americans don't. Well, it's partly because America's a world on its own. It thinks it's the best country in the world. It's in a sort of big bubble. Fewer than 50% of Americans have passports, and they don't understand that actually what happens in Europe does matter. And if Putin is successful in any way, that is a green light for dictators everywhere. And given that Europe has tried to help Ukraine, Putin being successful now, whatever that means, is even more of a defeat for freedom and liberty and Europe as a whole.
Yeah, and obviously to democratic values as well. And when it comes to understanding of the threat to the European security system, do you think this invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, helped European but also British population to wake up a little bit and understand what we're dealing?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
How do you notice that in the society currently?
I don't know all 50, all 70 million Britons. It's a hard question to answer. Certainly Russia is now seen, I'm sure, by people who are interested by the problem, as an essentially malign, malicious, evil business. In funny sort of way, more so now than in the years of the Cold War.
Is there still sort of admiration of Russia from cultural standpoint? Because
well, the BBC classical music program still plays Russian music, which makes me very cross. Yeah, and I think many people think that the great novelists of the 19th century have nothing to do with what's going on now, which of course isn't entirely true. But the interesting thing is increasing as a new generation of immigrant families, the next generation, are reaching adulthood in England. There's more and more awareness of the evils of colonialism, and more books are being published, not asking the stupid question, was the British Empire good or bad, but showing that there were many pretty awful aspects to the British Empire. It was colonialism, and sensible people understand that Russia is the last of the great
empires.
19th century colonial empires, and still has that, with Putin, still has that mentality, a mentality we all have largely lost, certainly in Britain. I don't think the French have. The French still think they're the greatest country in the world.
Well, it's a very British thing to say.
I'm joking. It's a joke. Yeah.
Obviously. Do you see the influence of Russian disinformation and propaganda in the UK currently? Because obviously we see how it influences...
Well, there are rumours that, Brexit was partly funded by Russia. There's a horrible man called Aaron Banks, who is a millionaire and gave more money to the Leave campaign than anybody else. And he's married to a Russian, and he had meetings with the Russian ambassador before Brexit. So it's all whispers and it's not clear. Whether Russian, certainly I'm sure Russia was trying, Brexit was hugely in Russia, in Putin's interest. Whether Russian misinformation actually had much impact or not, I don't know. Just like some people are saying with the American elections, in fact, although there were lots of Russian bots and influence, it probably didn't make very much difference. But Russia has tried, without a doubt. And now, actually, the head of internal British security, MI5, just gave an interview last week saying that Russia is actively campaigning to disrupt life in Britain.
Yeah, and their network of spies is pretty impressive, and how Europe has not been able to do anything about it in the last, 10 years or more even. You said that most sensible people, obviously, in the UK...
I think the other reason in the UK is we had Novichok, that was clear evidence of and the fact that the two GRU assassins then just casually throw a bottle of Novichok aside, say some poor English woman dies, was even worse, you might say, that Skripal and his daughter, well, they were spies, etc. But the whole thing, I think that did, and also, of course, the poisoning of Lipinov, what's he called? Is it Lipinov? Yeah. With polonium, and the fact the Russians were so careless, they left an obvious trail. I think that must have hugely influenced British opinion against Russia.
Given that, how do you feel about the recent exchange of political prisoners when from the West it was a bunch of Russian spies?
It's so difficult, isn't it? Because it's blackmail, and if by giving in to blackmail, you encourage the blackmail to do more, but then not helping your poor fellow nationals who have been arrested by the Russians, all as a negotiating ploy. I think it's the devil's own judgment. I cannot form an opinion on that. It's very difficult.
Obviously. Well, you say that the support largely in the UK didn't wear off. It's more like attention, obviously. People are focused on their own problems. What do you think Ukraine can do to foster that support, if anything, as somebody who's been here, who obviously sees how it's covered from there? Is there anything that maybe Ukrainians can do to stay in people's minds and hearts?
suffer more.
That's very cynical to say.
I don't like it.
Yeah. It's only that you think that people respond to other people's pain.
Yes, and it's what gets into the news. It's what drives politicians, saying Ukraine's a jolly nice country, jolly nice culture, and good musicians and artists and write jolly good books. That's not going to influence people.
But don't you think people get desensitized to
Yeah,
a lot of suffering?
They do. And at the moment, the world is in a terrible state. So it's very hard to feel very optimistic. But as has been said many times, if you feel negative, if you stop, we have a duty to be optimistic. If we stop hoping, we'll give up, and then indeed the worst will happen. Same with climate change. If we say global disaster is inevitable, we won't try to stop it. So one must go on fighting. It's easy for me. I fly back to London in 12 days' time. You lot have to stay here.
Yeah, no.
But all I can offer you is that your cause is just. It is the right cause. And you are, as you all know, and I know, and I wish more people realised it, and I try to do what little I can with publicity in England and write articles. And I'll try to write an article and guest into the press when I get back to England next week. You are fighting for the cause of liberty, for all of us, for all the free countries. But you lot are paying the price, and that's very cruel.
What kind of approach do you take when you write articles about Ukraine?
Well, I sort of write about myself, and then just try to tell stories of what I see. You see, when Rachel and I were here, that's 2 years ago now, and we were perfectly safe, but we arrived at the main railway station, and there were various enormous explosions as we arrived. And Rachel, being a professional journalist before she became a doctor, was very good at exploiting this to the full and doing sort of online live interviews with many UK media channels. So it made Rachel and me appear like incredibly brave English doctors, being bombed by the Russians. But it got lots of publicity. That's the sort of thing that works. So maybe if I get blown up in Odessa on Monday, that would be good for the Ukrainian cause.
I hope not, because that would be, I think, horrible for you.
I promised my wife I wouldn't go to Odessa, so I'm, keeping stum about that.
But that makes a lot of sense, because people, I think, sort of want to see this story sometimes through perspective of somebody of their own who they can relate to and who they know on some level as well. Yeah. You've came to Ukraine, correct me if I'm wrong, 10 times since the start of the full-scale invasion.
No, this is the sixth times.
Sorry.
Yep.
Coming there. Coming to the...
Well, the next plan is Rachel is trying to get Land Rover to give us a Land Rover for free, using all her media contacts, to be as a palliative care ambulance from the hospice in Zambia. So we're still waiting to hear the people in charge of Land Rover. We'll buy one anyway, but if Land Rover give us a new one for free, that would be rather nice.
Yeah, that's definitely.
And that would get lots of publicity,
Hopefully, yeah.
Well, it would in England, brave, heroic doctors, palliative care, driving into the war zone. You hype it up,
Yeah, definitely.
So that hopefully will happen next spring.
When was the first time you came since the start of the full-scale invasion?
It was in June 22.
2022.
Yeah. Mm.
What are some things that you noticed first, maybe after being in Ukraine?
Well, actually, in June 22, I noticed virtually nothing. It really didn't look very different, and the Russians weren't sending lots of missiles over at that time. There were a few sort of baby checkpoints of sandbags, but not much else. Even now, superficially, you don't, certainly in Kiev and Lviv, you don't, or Vinnytsia, you don't see any very obvious signs. But you know perfectly well, there's tragedy everywhere, and all the cemeteries now have Ukrainian flags flying for the dead soldiers, and every town and city has pictures of all the dead.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you said yourself that the world isn't really a bad place, and there's a lot of wars going on right now. Like Israel and Palestine currently.
And Sudan.
And Sudan.
It's a country I know well. I made many visits to work in Khartoum. It's a disaster, and nobody's looking,
Yeah, like that gets fairly no coverage at all.
Virtually none.
Yeah.
And it's a huge humanitarian catastrophe.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for us as well from here to follow what's happening around the world
because we're focused
on our own thing.
Rather like global warming, as my Ukrainian friend said. Well, we have more immediate problems to worry about, even though in retrospect, in the sight of history, climate change will probably be seen as a much bigger problem than the war in Ukraine, but that's in the future.
If somebody asks you why you sort of chose this cause and kept with it currently, when a lot of even humanitarian organizations, they moved on and now assisting other places around the world, what do you respond to people who ask you why Ukraine?
Because I think it's incredibly important. It's about European civilized values. Now, I'm increasingly feeling you can't include America in the world of civilized values, but of course you can. And my many friends. And if I did not continue to come here, I feel I would be betraying them. I do it despite my family hating it when I come here, but they accept I need to do it. And I do it because I can be useful. I can lecture and teach. And Rimizaka always arranges a busy program for me. And I hope it helps. I know that with the young medical students, they like hearing my lectures. I spent 1.5 hours yesterday signing books and being photographed. So that's very rewarding for me. I have this almost pathological need to be useful, And now, I'm 74 years old, I've got cancer, I don't know for how much longer I'll be able to be going on, continuing to be useful. But I think, we must all, it again comes back to my parents that, I was brought up to, as my mother told me quite specifically really, we're not brought here to enjoy ourselves, we're brought to the world to try to help others and make the world a better place. One's own happiness is ephemeral and transient. The greatest joy in life is helping others.
You talk a lot about the civilized values and democracy in general, and we started this conversation with talking about healthcare system specifically. What do you think the role of healthcare system in democracy, in building democracy?
It should be universal and free and not commercial. You can have a small commercial sector, but you need a robust government system where everybody gets as much as possible equal health care, irrespective of how wealthy they are or where they are on the social ladder. That's what you ought to aim for. In practice, it's impossible to achieve completely, but that's what you ought to do. And the American example is just terrible.
Yeah, I was just about to say, somebody from US would say, but doesn't free healthcare means communism?
Yeah, well, that's the Americans, Socialism.
Yeah, like...
You look at the facts, you look at the statistics about American healthcare. They spend more money per capita than anywhere else in the world. They spend a higher proportion of gross domestic product, almost 20%, on healthcare, and yet they have the highest rate of infant mortality, maternal mortality in all the developed countries. They have deteriorating life expectancy. They have 40,000, I think 100,000 deaths a year from opiate overdoses. They have, I think it's about 35,000 gunshot deaths a year, half of those suicide. The statistics are just terrible.
If you would pick, I guess, a country or place which Ukraine can look up as a sort of a model for healthcare, what country would it be?
The Scandi countries,
The Scandinavian.
But, these things take a long time and they're smaller countries. And nowhere's perfect, but they do pretty well. And of course, what characterizes them is they're much less wealth and income inequality than any other countries. Inequality of wealth is a terrible poison that poisons societies.
Definitely. You've talked a lot about hope and how that's a very important thing. What do you hope for Ukraine and for the world in general?
For Ukraine, I mean, it's very hard to see at the moment how you can regain the occupied territories, not without some massive infusion of military help from the West, which I don't think will come. So what you need, as you all know, is, firm, real guarantees, unlike the Budapest nonsense, that once a border has been established, Ukraine is safe and Russia cannot just build up its army and invade again. And I think that means joining NATO. And then, of course, that begs the question, would NATO work? But I think the threat of it would stop Putin if Ukraine was in NATO.
But a lot of people in NATO still hesitant about.
I know they are. They're cowards. And they're just not willing to look clearly. Everything involves a risk. It's like operating. If you say, I'm not going to operate because the patient might die, you'll save nobody, So you have to accept there's some risk involved. But you have to think, what's going to happen if there's a peace, if there's a Putin peace? We all know what that means. And that's because we all know what the war is really about, is Putin and his kleptocratic system struggling to survive. A successful, free, democratic, civil Ukraine is a deadly threat. If a post-Soviet Ukraine can become a free Western country, why not Russia? That's what it's really about. It's not about land.
Yeah.
The land is a means to the end of Putin trying to maintain his power.
But at the same time, he erases people at that land and completely destroys anything Ukrainian.
Exactly. I know, exactly. Yeah.
And what about the world? That's
climate change, which is all the. I read every week a science magazine, which covers many aspects of science, but it's always reporting on climate change. And all the indices are all going along the worst track predictions of the International Panel on Climate Change. Antarctica, the Arctic, Greenland are all melting much more quickly than the models used hitherto have suggested. So it's not tomorrow or next year, but there's a catastrophe in the making. And I mean, look at Florida.
Yeah, and the horrible hurricanes. Do you see any parallel between climate change denial and maybe how a lot of people deny actually the threat?
Yes, and we know from research that right-wing or authoritarian politics is part of a package. Neoliberal seeing a free market is a sort of cult belief that the market is always right, which led to the financial crash of 2008, and sort of admiration for the strongman leadership myth, and climate change denial. And it's rather curious that all those things almost always come together. And what they have in common is reluctance to accept that the world is complicated. They want simple, like conspiracy theories. If something goes wrong, somebody must be at fault. There must be a single cause. When, of course, in reality, like with disease, only 30% of heavy smokers get lung cancer. Most diseases are multifactorial. It's not if A, then B, but it's complicated. And I think that populism appeals mainly to poorly educated people who want simple answers to complex problems. And the problem for sort of liberals like me, I'm not a socialist. I suppose I'm a sort of social democrat. But liberals, we say, well, it's complicated, but that's not sexy. It doesn't sell newspapers. It's complicated. There are no easy answers. So I think that's what populism and right-wing politics has in common. And an element of denial. To actually look climate change in the face. The climate scientists are all terrified. They really are. They're seeing terrible things happening. And many of the newspapers are just turning away and writing about footballers' wives and pop stars jumping off balconies and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's, as a Ukrainian, I felt like that when watching Don't Look Up, that movie that is sort of sarcastically talks about climate change. But a lot of the things like right now, because I think I watched it before the full-scale invasion, you can almost apply to Russia and how people do not see what the threat of Russia is, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world.
This axis of evil of North Korea, Iran, Xi Jinping and Russia, they're autocrats, they're bullies, basically. And they're coming back to Englishness. We don't like bullies, and that's right.
You mentioned all the work that you're doing, from delivering cars to palliative care work projects. What is something that you maybe weren't able to achieve in terms of helping that you want to do in the future?
Well, I try to be realistic in what I can do. No, I think looking back on my work with Ukrainian colleagues over the years, I'm pretty happy. I'm very sad about the end of my relationship with the first surgeon I worked with. I'm sad. Actually, I should have stopped working with him sooner. I refused to see, but actually his decision-making was getting very bad. And he was moving away from the sort of philosophical course I thought I was trying to steer him on. So I regret that. I should have stopped working with him earlier. No, I'm happy with the way things are going. I mean, my only worry is my health and how much longer I can go on. I'm fortunate I can afford it because I have a pension, but also I was given quite a lot of money by my English patients over the years because of my charitable work. The movie, The English Surgeon, about my work here 14 years ago got a lot of publicity. It got an Emmy for the best science documentary. Not that I made the movie myself. So I can afford the flights coming out here. And I've always had this sort of rule when working in other countries, and although most of my work has been in Ukraine, I have worked in other countries as well, like Sudan and Nepal, is once I'm actually here, my colleagues pay for everything. So it's not just charity, it's an equal relationship. It's really important if you want to do the sort of work I do. But it's not charitable. I want to help because I enjoy doing it. It's rewarding for me. I say, here I am, make use of me, But I would hate it if any of the countries I work in or have worked in, if any of the people felt I was being condescending in any way. And if you're going to do work of this sort, you need to go back regularly, not just this or hit and run consultancy, look at the strange natives and then bugger off again. So it has to be a proper regular commitment, which obviously many people cannot or don't want to do.
And they also fail to sort of learn about the place where they go very often.
Yeah. And as always things, the longer you go to a country, the less you understand, and all your presuppositions go.
Last question that we ask all of our speakers here, and all of them tend to travel to Ukraine multiple times. What is your favorite place in Ukraine, if you could describe one, if you can pick one?
Yeah. I wrote a piece for an online magazine. It's Atlas Cafe in Lviv. It's a nice cafe with arched ceilings in the old square in the center of Lviv. And I sit there and meet my friends there, and I feel very at home there. Lviv is a beautiful old city.
Yeah, and it became home for a lot of Ukrainians too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you do and for this interview. And I hope you continue coming and I will, Julia. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to hopefully see you in London.
Actually, I do have one regret. When I was lecturing to hundreds of medical students in Vinnytsia yesterday evening, I after the meeting had ended and most of the audience had gone, somebody wanted to video me for their TikTok channel. And I said Slava Ukraini, and then like a sort of belted out the last 20 or 30 people, all said, "Heroen Slava." And I really regret at the end of my lecture, when I had about, 300 or 400 people, I should have said Slava Ukraini, and there would have been this deafening roar in return. That would have been great. But I forgot.
Well, hopefully you get more opportunities like that to say.
I will try.
Slava Ukraini.
I will try.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this is being filmed because the BBC is making yet another documentary about me, but they wouldn't let the film crew come out to Ukraine. So they gave me a little camera, and Andrei has been filming various bits of my visit, and he'll film me handing over the four-wheel drive car I bought for the military guys quite soon, in fact, within the next hour.
Well, that's incredible. Well, we're looking forward to see that hopefully soon. And again, thank you so much for your work and for caring about Ukraine.
Будь ласка.
Thank you so much for watching this interview. Henry Marsh was our guest today, and we've talked about a lot of different topics from neurosurgery, medical system in Ukraine to the Western support and why people should care about Ukraine. If you want to see more content like this, definitely subscribe to our channel and support Ukrainer through the link below and leave any comments and likes below. Thank you so much.